The first scream came before sunrise. Old Martha Hensley heard it drifting across the mountains while fog swallowed the narrow roads of Black Pine Ridge. She had lived beside the Appalachian forests her entire life, and she knew the difference between animal cries and something far worse. This sound rose from deep inside Ash Hollow, the forbidden stretch of wilderness beyond the old mining trails. It sounded human. By nightfall, 31 children were gone. Black Pine Ridge had always lived beneath fear. The mining town rested between cliffs, black pine forests, and abandoned tunnels carved into the mountains generations earlier. People survived hard winters, cave collapses, sickness, and hunger. Yet nothing terrified them more than the stories surrounding Ash Hollow. Parents warned children never to wander near the ravine after sunset. Hunters claimed voices echoed through the trees, calling their names. Miners whispered about hidden tunnels beneath the mountain, where strange breathing echoed from the darkness. Most townsfolk dismissed those stories as mountain superstition, until Pastor Abel Merrick organized the church picnic. 31 children followed their teacher into the forest, carrying baskets filled with bread, apples, and blankets. Thunder rolled above the mountains, while dark clouds gathered overhead, but nobody expected danger. The adults remained behind, preparing supper for their return. The children never came back. Heavy rain swallowed the trails before sunset. Families waited outside the church with lanterns, while wind screamed through the trees surrounding town. Near midnight, the horses finally returned, dragging the empty wagon alone. The animals shook violently. Deep claw marks covered the wooden sides of the wagon, as though something enormous had attacked it during the storm. Inside rested 31 soaked ribbons, tied carefully into circles across the benches. Sheriff Wallace Boone gathered every able-bodied man before dawn. The search party entered the forest, carrying lanterns, rifles, and ropes, while rain continued falling across the mountains. Most trails disappeared beneath mud, except for dozens of tiny barefoot footprints leading toward Ash Hollow. Nobody wanted following them. The deeper they traveled, the quieter the wilderness became. Birds vanished. Insects stopped chirping. Even the wind disappeared beneath the towering black pines. One father discovered abandoned lunch baskets hanging from tree branches beside the ravine. Another found a child's shoe covered with mud and blood near the roots of a dead tree. Sheriff Boone noticed strange markings beside the tracks, resembling hoofprints burned into wet soil. That night, the men camped near Ash Hollow. While sitting beside the fire, they heard children laughing somewhere beyond the darkness. Several fathers rushed into the woods, believing survivors wandered nearby, but they returned moments later, trembling with terror. They had found footprints circling the camp, barefoot tracks, small enough belonging to children. Pastor Merrick insisted frightened survivors were hiding somewhere nearby, though his voice shook while speaking. An elderly miner finally admitted the abandoned tunnels beneath Ash Hollow, connected with older caverns buried deep inside the mountains, places nobody entered anymore. Before sunrise, Sheriff Boone awoke beside the dying fire and realized every lantern around camp had been extinguished. Fresh footprints surrounded the sleeping men. Then the singing started. Children's voices echoed from somewhere beneath the ravine, singing an old church hymn completely out of rhythm. The melody sounded slow, broken, and wrong. The search party followed the sound toward an abandoned mining entrance hidden beneath tangled roots and stone. Frost covered the rock surrounding the tunnel, despite the humid summer air outside. Inside, the darkness felt alive. Water dripped endlessly from the ceiling while rusted mining tracks vanished deeper underground. Strange whistles echoed ahead like children calling from beyond collapsed walls. Then the men found the handprints. Dozens of tiny bloody handprints covered the coal walls beside scattered shoes and ribbons. One father collapsed, crying after recognizing his son's leather boot half buried beneath mud. Sheriff Boone pushed deeper despite rising panic. The tunnel eventually opened into a massive underground cavern. Bones littered the rocky floor beside melted candles, animal carcasses, and ancient symbols carved into stone. At the center stood a massive well, descending endlessly into darkness. One miner leaned over the edge before stumbling backward, screaming. He claimed pale faces moved far below the darkness, staring upward. Nobody else saw them, but scratching sounds immediately echoed from the well. A freezing wind swept through the cavern, extinguishing several lanterns at once. In complete darkness, voices whispered each searcher's name from different corners of the cave. Then the singing returned. Closer this time, Sheriff Boone followed the voices through a narrow passage where 31 small handprints covered the walls. Every print pointed deeper underground toward complete darkness. A frightened child's voice suddenly whispered beside his ear, "Please don't let it hear you." The next storm arrived 5 days later. Thunder shook Black Pine Ridge, while terrified townsfolk gathered outside the church after hearing screams from the forest edge. 4 children staggered from the trees, barefoot and covered with mud. Only 4. The survivors looked wrong. Their pale faces appeared hollow, as though they had not slept for years. Strange bruises circled their wrists and necks like burned fingerprints pressed beneath the skin. None of them cried. Pastor Merrick brought the children inside the church while mothers prepared blankets and warm soup. The children refused food completely and stared silently toward the windows throughout the night. One girl named Eleanor kept counting backward beneath her breath. Doctors from neighboring towns arrived attempting to question the survivors, but every answer came slowly, almost painfully, as though the children struggled remembering ordinary words. Sheriff Boone finally asked what happened beneath Ash Hollow. The children exchanged terrified glances before a boy named Samuel finally spoke. He claimed something inside the tunnels copied human voices. Samuel described hearing his dead mother calling through the darkness beneath the mountain. Other children followed voices belonging to missing relatives, miners, and friends. The deeper they walked underground, the louder those impossible voices became. Eleanor suddenly screamed and pointed toward the church basement. "She's down there," she whispered. Moments later, every church bell began ringing violently, without anyone touching the ropes. Terrified townsfolk searched the church but found nobody inside. However, muddy barefoot tracks appeared leading from the basement stairs toward the altar. The tracks stopped directly beneath the crucifix. That night, the surviving children refused sleeping unless every mirror inside the church became covered. Whenever reflections appeared accidentally, the children panicked and begged people not to look behind them. Near midnight, Eleanor awoke screaming. Sheriff Boone stepped outside, carrying his lantern. After she whispered, somebody waited near the trees. Lightning illuminated the forest for one horrifying second. 31 children stood silently between the black pines. Every missing child stared toward the church without blinking. Then they vanished. Something enormous moved slowly behind the trees afterward. The following morning, snow began falling across Black Pine Ridge, despite summer barely reaching the mountains. Livestock died inside locked barns overnight, while strange whispers echoed through homes after dark. Every surviving child developed fevers. Pastor Merrick stayed beside Eleanor while she trembled beneath blankets and stared toward empty corners of the room. Finally, she described what waited beneath Ash Hollow. The missing children had discovered a hidden underground chamber. At the center stood a massive stone doorway covered with moving symbols. Samuel explained the carvings resembled twisting faces whenever lantern light touched them. The children heard breathing echoing from behind the sealed doorway continuously. Something lived behind it, something ancient. The survivors described wandering endless tunnels while unseen footsteps followed close behind them. Whenever somebody tried escaping, the tunnels shifted direction and led them deeper underground. Then they encountered the pale figures. A boy named Caleb described childlike creatures hiding beside underground pools, with black eyes and stretched smiles. Whenever lanterns illuminated them, the creatures copied every movement perfectly. Sheriff Boone noticed the survivors always refused, describing whatever existed beyond the stone doorway. Whenever questioned directly, they became terrified into silence. Late one evening, Eleanor grabbed Pastor Merrick's arm with shocking force. "It knows everyone now," she whispered. That same night, townsfolk began hearing relatives calling outside their homes after midnight. Several fathers followed the voices into the forest, believing their missing children finally returned. None of them came back. Before organizing another search party, Pastor Merrick uncovered strange carvings beneath the church floorboards, matching the symbols described upon the underground doorway. Beneath them rested a horrifying message scratched into the wood: "Never open the hollow. Something ancient sleeps beneath Appalachia." Rain hammered the church roof, while Pastor Merrick searched forgotten storage rooms beneath the sanctuary. Inside a rotting chest, he uncovered journals belonging to Reverend Josiah Bell, Black Pine Ridge's first pastor. Every page described disappearances surrounding Ash Hollow, stretching back generations. Children vanished. Families heard voices calling from wells and forests. Entire households abandoned their homes after hearing dead relatives outside during storms. Sheriff Boone read silently while thunder shook the stained glass windows. According to the journals, settlers eventually discovered underground caverns beneath Ash Hollow. Deep inside stood a stone doorway imprisoning something called the Listener. Reverend Bell believed the entity learned human voices before luring victims underground through perfect imitation. One journal entry described settlers attempting sealing the tunnels using dynamite and fire. The following night, 11 children disappeared. Their parents later heard them singing beneath church floors after midnight. Pastor Merrick uncovered another horrifying truth. Generations earlier, terrified settlers made a bargain with the listener. In exchange for protection from famine, winter, and mining disasters, the entity demanded sacrifices. Children. Sheriff Boone realized the disappearances were never random. Somebody inside Black Pine Ridge had continued honoring the bargain for generations. Before dawn, Boone visited an elderly widow named Edith Harrow, living near abandoned mining trails. The moment he mentioned the listener, hopelessness filled her eyes. Her ancestors helped create the bargain. Every 30 years, children vanished because the listener demanded souls, keeping the doorway sealed. The sacrifice fails whenever survivors escape, Edith whispered. Thunder rolled across the mountains. Eleanor suddenly appeared outside the cabin, barefoot and soaking wet. Her eyes had turned completely black. When she spoke, dozens of overlapping voices emerged together. The doorway is opening tonight. Church bells rang wildly before sunrise. Families awoke screaming as every surviving child walked sleepily toward Ash Hollow through thick fog. Sheriff Boone gathered armed townsfolk beside the church, while Pastor Merrick carried Reverend Bell's journal. Nobody spoke during the march into the forest. Whispers drifted through the trees from empty darkness surrounding them. Near the ravine, Eleanor and the other survivors stood motionless beside the abandoned mine entrance. Black veins spread beneath their pale skin. When Boone called their names, they answered together using unfamiliar voices. Without warning, the children entered the tunnels, singing church hymns slowly. The townsfolk followed desperately through freezing darkness, while enormous footsteps echoed deep underground. The tunnels twisted unnaturally until the searchers reached the massive cavern once again. Hundreds of candles burned beside piles of bones surrounding the stone doorway. This time, it stood slightly open. Darkness moved behind the crack like something breathing. Sheriff Boone heard dozens of children whispering from beyond the opening. Some voices belonged to children missing decades earlier. Others sounded ancient and horribly inhuman. Pastor Merrick opened Reverend Bell's journal and discovered hidden final pages. The listener could never escape unless invited above ground by survivors carrying part of it within themselves. The returned children had become vessels. Eleanor stepped toward the doorway while black liquid streamed slowly from her mouth. "It's lonely," she whispered. Shadowy hands stretched outward from the darkness behind her. Several fathers rushed forward, rescuing the children before they disappeared beyond the doorway completely. The cavern immediately shook violently, while terrible screams echoed through the tunnels. One father vanished instantly after unseen claws dragged him into darkness. Sheriff Boone grabbed Eleanor while Pastor Merrick hurled burning lantern oil across the doorway. Flames exploded through the cavern. The listener screamed. The sound thundered through the mountains like the earth itself tearing apart. Shadowy figures burned within the darkness while the surviving children collapsed unconscious onto the stone floor. The tunnels began collapsing. Sheriff Boone and the remaining townsfolk carried the children toward the surface while rocks crashed around them. Behind them, the stone doorway shattered beneath fire and falling stone. Then silence swallowed the mountain. At sunrise, Black Pine Ridge stood beneath, drifting ash and fog. Ash Hollow collapsed forever beneath thousands of tons of rock. The surviving children never fully recovered. Some nights they still woke screaming about voices beneath the earth. Others claimed shadowy figures stood outside their windows watching silently from the trees. Sheriff Boone sealed Reverend Bell's journals inside the church basement, hoping nobody would ever uncover the truth again. But every summer night, whenever fog drifts across the mountains, the people of Black Pine Ridge still hear children singing beneath the ground. And sometimes, during thunderstorms, another voice joins them, listening,